Good afternoon, Anthony. Looking forward to our part 3 on Viterol, probably wrapping up the series. And our foci today are going to be on how humans are relatively unique in the animal kingdom and how we access Viterol, formerly vitamin D, and discussing whether supplementing with Viterol or getting our blood concentrations up to a certain point can be very beneficial for most humans across the planet, given that we, in all likelihood, are subclinically deficient in Viterol as a species in most parts of the planet. Does that encapsulate the two themes that we're looking at today?
Yes, I think so. And our general theme in this whole 3 podcast series is the confusion. The fact that Viterol, formerly known as vitamin D, is a very confusing entity in all its aspects. And that certainly applies to the 2 questions that we're dealing with today. Which one would you like to start with?
Let's look at how ungulates get their Viterol, shall we?
Yes, well, one way to frame this is that with humans, it's rather difficult to be sufficient in Viterol, at least in the modern context, because the food chain that leads to such sufficiency is rather improbable. It's rather tenuous, because firstly, you have to get into, not just into sunshine enough, but you have to get into a certain quality of sunshine frequently enough, which is not easily achieved in today's world. And secondly, if you want to get your Viterol through the oral route, that's actually more difficult than most people realize. You have to overcome some hurdles, some of them psychological, in making sure that you get enough of Viterol. So it's quite difficult, really. And in contrast to that, something like a wild ungulate, a wild ruminant, like an antelope or a deer, or also the domesticated derivatives of such animals, they actually have a much easier time of it, even though their Viterol requirements are, if anything, larger than ours. And that's because of a strange circumstance in nature in which the whole food chain upon which they get their Viterol is differently calibrated. So for human beings, we've got to eat things that are relatively rich in Viterol, like fish oil or special supplements. And we have to negotiate all the difficulties of getting enough skin synthesis by in light of all the different climates that we live in and our different levels of skin pigmentation. But for a wild ruminant, it's dead easy, because something very interesting happens, and that is that when their forage base, like for grass in the case of sheep, when their forage base is at its ebb, when all they've got to eat in the world is dry grass, equivalent to either straw or hay, which is particularly poor in protein and in mineral nutrients and in energy, that's when the Viterol concentration in the forage is greatest. And that's because their Viterol food chain is based on a substance called ergocalciferol, in contrast to the cholecalciferol upon which our food chain is based. And ergocalciferol, as nature has ordained, has a much more lenient criterion for photosynthesis. So for us to photosynthesize Viterol in our skins is quite demanding, because it takes a certain intensity of sunlight, which means a certain angle of the sun above the horizon and a certain latitudinal criterion. And so there are large chunks of the world which seasonally can produce no Viterol in our skins at all. Whereas for a sheep living in a fairly challenging environment, like a natural prairie, or even if it's at a fairly high latitude, like the prairies of North America or the steppes of Russia, it still gets plenty of Viterol, because ergocalciferol can be formed by ultraviolet radiation, with far less intense sunlight than is true for our case. So precisely when their forage is at its ebb in every other way, when it's at its minimum nutritional value for energy, protein, mineral nutrients, and so on, that's when it has its greatest content of ergocalciferol. So the animal more or less has a compensatory system in which it's charged up with this vital health-promoting substance just at the time when all its other health parameters are likely to go down because of seasonal shortage. And so ruminants and wild herbivores live in a rather different kind of a world when it comes to Viterol, formerly known as vitamin D.
Great, thanks. Can you just remind me how ergocalciferol fits in with plankton and then oily fish? The plankton are also generating ergocalciferol, is that right?
Yes, it's the same kind of principle as in the temperate prairies of the world, because in, for example, the North Sea next to Britain, there's never the kind of intensity of sunshine that could make any considerable amount of Viterol in a human skin. It's always too wan, too oblique, too dim. But the plankton in the surface of that sea have the same setting as the fungi in the prairie grasses. And what that means is that just a little bit of sunshine penetrating a little way through the water surface can actually activate the precursor in those algal unicellular bodies and make enough Viterol in those planktonic organisms such that when the dead bodies of the organisms settle down onto the sea floor in the North Sea, then a kind of detritivorous fish, such as the cod, eats that material and concentrates the Viterol in its oil particularly, and also in its liver. And so if we eat those fishes, based on that rather forgiving and lenient food chain based again on ergocalciferol in the marine plankton, then we can supplement our Viterol supply quite powerfully. If that were not true,
Sorry, we're getting cholecalciferol from the oily fish, not so.
Yes, we are through a conversion process. That's a very good point. I'm not sure that's been stated clearly enough in the literature. But the original form is the ergocalciferol in the actual algae. And then presumably the fish converts that to cholecalciferol, which we then ingest in the form of cod liver oil or fish oil more generally if we eat oily fishes. And even the livers of other oily fishes,
I can see how ungulates across the world are getting a nice dose of Viterol via their dry grass. But what about countless other animals, from wolves to gorillas? They're not benefiting from dry grass. So,
well, that's a very good question. That's an excellent question, and it's right at the edge of our knowledge, because not enough research has been done to answer that question. And there are potentially decades or even centuries of research to be done just to answer those questions for the various groups. But presumably, many animals have two different, one or both of two different photosynthetic mechanisms. One is little bare places on their anatomy, such as, for example, the rhinarium, the bare part of the nose, that can photosynthesize even if it's somewhat pigmented. And in other cases, like in the Felidae, the cat family, what they do is they secrete oil from their hair follicles or from their sebaceous glands in their skin, which then coats the fur. That is then subject to photosynthesis when the animal lies in the sun. And then the cat licks up that oily precursor, and then it goes to the liver and then to the kidneys and provides Viterol that way. So there's various mechanisms, but we can't answer that comprehensively because nobody's really done the investigations much except in a few cases.
But just that one simple fact, this is mainstream knowledge that cats lick their fur to get Viterol formerly known as vitamin D. There's no debate about that, is that right?
Well, I think there's no debate about that simply because nobody's paying much attention. It's one of those factoids that one takes as given just because somebody found it, somebody got that into the literature, and there hasn't really been much discussion of it. So it may be wrong, but it's not like there's some big debate about it. I think we have to go on what we see published in the literature, and that is the sort of factoid. I would call it a factoid rather than a fact. But we have to go with something, in order to.
Yeah, it's a wonderful factoid to gestate on, because if natural selection has led to that physiological process and adaptation on the part of a cat, it does hint at every animal needing to find some way to get this compound. I mean, it's just a critical feature of life then, isn't it?
Well, for vertebrates, it seems to be so, yes.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure, for example, when you come back to the North Sea marine plankton, I don't know whether the unicellular algal organisms actually use that substance. Presumably they do, but it's hard to know.
Yeah. So we just don't know how a gorilla deep in a rainforest, not getting much UVB, not eating much dry grass, how it gets enough Viterol. It's a delicious question. We don't even have any ideas, do we?
I think you're right. I think that's a correct framing. The research field is wide open.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the intuitive answer is that many animals, even ones living in the shade, love to sun themselves.
Okay.
That's a general pattern. Is even animals of dense cover, they love to come out into a glade and just doze off in the sun. There's a kind of a doze off response, which you can feel in the human species as well. The moment you get in the sun, you tend to doze off, which tends to prolong your exposure to the sun in a delicious, pleasant kind of a way. And presumably, even though the skin of gorillas is dark pigmented, if the animal remains in the sun enough at the right time of day, it can get enough photosynthesis to keep going. But we just don't know really, because you see, the puzzle is that human beings are remarkably demanding for this substance, such that most modern people throughout the world are actually subclinically deficient. That's generally recognized. So if we are so demanding, and some of us actually have pale skin and have supplements in the form of fish oils and so on, and we still wind up as a population generally subclinically deficient, then how on earth does a gorilla manage with its dark skin and a diet that contains nothing like oily fishes?
That's the puzzle.
Yeah, that's right. It's actually such a big puzzle that I wish somebody would go out and research it soon.
Well, it fits beautifully under our banner of an incredibly confusing topic. Yeah.
Well, that's right. That is right. Yeah.
And I suppose it's starting to move into our second theme, this question. But this thought of being subclinically deficient is troubling for an evolutionary biologist. Perhaps not all of them, but I would think many evolutionary biologists, because there's this underlying thinking in biology that most species are operating in a really close to an optimal manner. If you think of an impala in the veldt, it's getting enough Viterol and it's getting enough other nutrients, and it's a relatively optimized machine. Do you think that's incorrect? I mean, when we start talking about humans, we're talking about subclinical deficiencies across the planet in Viterol. It doesn't stack up for my biological training.
Yes, well, the picture that seems to be emerging is this, that you can have fully healthy animals, you can have obviously ill animals, and we can call them clinically ill.
Yeah.
And then not only do you have a gray zone of intermediates, but there's many different levels in that intermediacy. So if you come to the human species, you can have fully vital individuals whose metabolisms are working optimally, conferring great vitality on them in every way. Strong thought, well-functioning brains, good reproductive urges, lots of metabolic energy, physical energy, a drive, ambition, and then at the other end of the scale, you can have people who are so frankly deficient that they're half alive. But those aren't the fascinating aspects. The fascinating aspects are all the intermediates. And it just seems like most of the world's population is hovering in that intermediate zone where they're not fully alive in some sense. They're not ill enough to be diagnosed as ill as such.
Yeah.
So that's what's intriguing about it, is they're nominally functioning, but they're actually functioning considerably below what is possible genetically. And,
from a Viterol perspective, I think we discussed it in the first part. That means this gray zone is you're not experiencing rickets, but you're not experiencing optimal immune function, for example. Just to bring it back to that part one, that's what we're saying here?
That's what we're saying.
Yeah.
A lot of obesity, laziness, dispiritedness, lassitude, lack of ambition, a lot of things that beset the human being could be this kind of multi-level subclinical deficiency, not only in Viterol, but in other crucial factors. For example, I've been misguided enough twice in my life to be too vegetarian. My natural metabolism requires red meat, I've discovered. But for various reasons, I tried in a quite determined way on 2 occasions in my life to cut out as much red meat as possible. I did still eat some flesh foods, like, for example, some seafood. But on 2 occasions, I'm ashamed to say, I actually became clinically vitamin B12 deficient. And so I experienced what most people do in that circumstance, which is kind of half aliveness. But you see, you get used to it. And it was only when I had this rather miraculous B12 injection on both occasions that I actually realized what I had been missing. Because what's marvelous about having the corrective B12 injection is the very next day you feel alive again for the first time in months. And so that experience taught me what it's like to be half alive in a physiological sense. And because people get used to it, and they get used to it at the scale of whole societies, nobody notices that we have this subtle tragedy of humans in large numbers living at a fraction of their natural vitality and their natural potential. And in this context, Viterol is very important because I think it's one of the, say, top 10 factors in the body that are crucial for maintaining full vitality. And correcting that lack of vitality in the general population, numbering billions of people worldwide, is not as simple as it may seem because of many different factors: economic, psychological, medical, physiological, nutritional, and so on. It's no easy matter.
Yeah. Just returning, coming back to that topic shortly, but do you think humans are fairly unique in this regard, or are the tens of thousands of impala in the Kruger Park also likely to be suboptimal in their vigor?
Again, I think that is the cutting edge question. I think the question you've just asked is right at the forefront of the conceptual framework of research in this field. In other words, we just don't know. And it's possible that something deeply interesting and disturbing is happening right in front of us that we haven't twigged onto yet. And that is that many or most species in nature are actually operating subpar. They're operating sufficiently to reproduce and maintain themselves, but they're not actually fully alive in the sense that they're not manifesting their genetic potential for complete vitality in terms of metabolism, growth, reproduction, cognition, and so on. because they're subclinically deficient at various grades of subclinical deficiency in more than one factor, of which Viterol is one of the most important. And so putting the thought experiment slightly differently, if you were to take that population and experiment with it in such a way that you made sure that the animals were fully sufficient in all of these factors, and we're talking about things like selenium, the micronutrient selenium, which is widespread deficient in humans. I would say probably 90% of people in the world are subclinically deficient in selenium. Iodine. Iodine is a remarkable substance because you can be fully nourished in every respect, but because of the dietary peculiarities and the biochemical idiosyncrasies of iodine, you can have complete sufficiency in everything except iodine. Because a diet that's healthy and balanced in every other respect can easily lack sufficient iodine to keep your thyroid and various other metabolic functions going at full speed, as it were. So selenium, iodine, Viterol, formerly known as vitamin D, and probably a few others that are a bit more elusive. When you have concurrent subclinical deficiency in those aspects of your intake, I think you can live a half-life and more tragically do so unnoticed for long periods and at large scales. In other words, whole populations of organisms for centuries on end, potentially all living a half-life, as it were, relative to their genetic potential. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a fascinating framing, because when you visit the Kruger Park or the Masai Mara and you look out at all that wonderful wildlife, you assume that the natural state is an optimal state. But here we're questioning that. And
well, here's a specific example involving those kinds of animals. Now, there's a thing called white muscle disease, such that, and it was discovered when people started chasing ungulates in order to capture them for game translocation programs. They found, like chasing them with a helicopter under a fairly stressed situation into a boma, into a holding pen and so on, and then transporting them. But there's a certain amount of exertion that goes on because the animals are fleeing for their lives. They don't understand what's happening. And one of the main problems with this in the early days of game capture was that you got a thing called white muscle disease, wherein the animal nominally survived the capture process, but then over a period of days it declined and died. And histological examination of its muscle tissues showed these white areas, white lesions, as it were, in the muscle tissue that was then traced to subclinical selenium deficiency. So that indicates that these animals are subclinically deficient in selenium, but that doesn't really show up until they're stressed by having to flee in a way that's unnaturally prolonged or panicked. And then you get quite, significant mortality out of the blue because suddenly you realize these animals are not operating with a full deck as far as selenium is concerned. And it's only when you look at an animal like the pronghorn antelope, which happens to live on selenium-rich prairies, that you see what the full potential of an ungulate can be, because the pronghorn antelope illustrates something really fascinating. It doesn't exist in a predatory environment any more demanding than an impala does. In fact, if anything, less so, because at least for the last 10,000 years, the pronghorn antelope has been living in a rather predator-depleted Holocene environment, with basically just the wolf running after it, compared to all the different carnivores in an African situation. And yet the pronghorn antelope is considerably more athletic, fast-running, enduring, and so on than any African antelope. And so its settings are so much higher. The pronghorn antelope is the supreme athlete of the mammalian world in terms of a combination of speed and endurance, not because it's been pressured to do so by predation. It's simply because it has enough selenium in its environment that it can do that. It can be this super athletic animal because its environment supports, the whole muscular skeletal system, a large heart, lungs of great capacity, tremendous metabolic rate, and rapid muscle movement over long periods, improbably long periods. You can chase these animals for a much longer distance than you can for African game, and they just take it all in their stride. And who knows why that is so, but I suspect that it's because they have this naturally selenium-rich pasture.
Yeah,
So
fascinating.
the pronghorn animal is an example of just naturally an animal that naturally lives in top gear, as it were, because it's just getting really super nutrition.
So could you frame it like this, Anthony, that the impala and the Kruger are optimal given the resources available, but it's certainly not optimal if relative to waving a magic wand and allowing evolution to run its course again and have as much selenium, iodine, zinc, copper, cobalt, whatever, all these nutrients. If there was no limitation, then they would be operating at a much faster metabolic, stronger metabolic physiological state.
I think we're saying both things. I think we're suggesting both things. We're suggesting that in an environment like that of the pronghorn, the genetic nature of the animal has leveled up, as it were, to make full use of the resources. And so the animal has this gigantic heart and, great aerobic capacity and a form and function that enables it to run so fast and so long. But it's simultaneously true that an animal like an impala, which is naturally genetically attuned to a less rich nutritional environment, also can be boosted to some degree. So there's a genetic potential, and then there's the phenotypic reality. And so it might be possible to take a population of impalas that is living in a suboptimal nutritional environment and actually boost their vitality considerably by at least allowing them to exercise the full genetic potential that they do possess. And, translating that to the human realm, it could be that many or most of the world's people could live much more vital and full lives if somehow it could be ensured that they just get enough. We're not talking about superpowers or particular prowess. We're just talking about restoring metabolic normalcy to human beings. This is the important thing about Viterol. When you take 6 capsules per day on average for the rest of your life of Viterol, which means 6,000 international units, as opposed to the normal accepted dose, which is 1 or 2 if on a good day, if you're lucky, then it's important to understand that all you're doing is restoring normalcy to your body, normalcy to your immune function, normalcy to the various other functions involved. And so what's interesting about this is that most people are not operating with full normalcy. Instead, the biological system is geared such that you can actually operate. I hesitate to use the word zombie because it sounds derogatory, but nature has arranged that many or most people can operate half cock, as it were, and still give every semblance of being somewhat normal. There's reproduction going on. People are going to work. But you see, that kind of population is constantly dogged by small infections, colds, things that people take as inevitable. Colds, flu, headache, a bit of arthritis, whatever. Things that people take as inevitable, trivial sufferings of life. And I suspect they're not inevitable, because in a fully nourished society, those colds and flus and things just wouldn't happen. Your body's not meant to have them. It has them in a tolerable way when you happen to be in a subclinically deficient state. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So if we supplement with Viterol, Anthony, it's unlikely to be a panacea because there are going to be other factors in all likelihood constraining our vigor. Is that right?
Well, we just don't know. I mean, there's 2 possibilities here. If you take a population that is subclinically deficient in Viterol, which could be any one of many different populations in the world today, and you just made darn sure that you brought up their Viterol levels to what amounts to normalcy, and you can do that in a variety of ways. You can give them 6,000 international units a day for several weeks, or you can give them a massive injection. That's equally good. Or you can take calcifediol, which is the active form, which gets into the blood almost immediately, instead of having to go through the liver and the kidneys in the form of a series of conversions. So if you did a thought experiment or even a real experiment in which you brought a whole population up to normalcy overnight, it would be very interesting to see whether their health corrected in a significant way over a broad front. And that would be because Viterol is just a kind of, shall we say, something approaching a panacea. It's a substance so important that if you just get it right, then a lot of other things just snap into place and follow it. On the other hand, it could well be that unless people are generally more or less healthy in many different aspects, they're not obese, they don't have too many comorbidities, they don't have arthritis, they don't have autoimmune disease, they're sufficient in vitamin C and so on. So unless people are more or less healthy, then bringing their Viterol up to par would not actually make much difference, because in a fairly unhealthy person overall, it could be that the Viterol, even if restored to a satisfactory blood concentration, won't be efficient in the functions that it's capable of being efficient in a more healthy person. And so we don't know whether Viterol leads or follows or something in between. And it's tempting to think that it leads. It's tempting to think that if you just get that one thing right, maybe in combination with, say, selenium and iodine, maybe if you just get those three crucial things right, then a person's health profile can transform very rapidly into something more vital. I would like to think that the latter is true, because it's a nice thought. But probably the more realistic reality is that health is multifactorial, and you have to get several other things right at the same time as getting Viterol right. Does that make sense?
It does, and it highlights the difficulty of testing whether a particular vitamin is important for health or not. The medical literature is full of failed experiments as far as vitamin supplementation goes. And it's possibly because of this reason that, you may be deficient in vitamin X, but if you supplement vitamin X, you're not going to pick up any noticeable improvements, because you're still deficient in other things that prevent an optimal level of vitamin X improving your health. Do you agree that it's just a minefield trying to tease out the effects of vitamins on health?
I suspect that that's a reality, but I also hold out for the possibility that wonder upon wonders, it might actually prove true that that Viterol might be the most transforming of all of these factors that we're talking about. And if you just get that one thing right, then a lot of things become possible that would not be possible otherwise. I would like to think that that's true, and I think it's worth doing some kind of scientific investigation to test that. Because it's such an important. The thing about Viterol is that it affects so many different systems in your body, way beyond what was initially thought in terms of calcium and phosphorus metabolism and bone formation. That was just the tip of the iceberg. We now know that it extends to immunity generally and many other functions. And just in terms of immunity, I mean, I look back on my own life with a certain tragicomedic perspective, because, quite recently I went through years on end in which my expectation was to get at least 6 colds every year. I mean, I found that unfortunate and wearisome, but for me, it was normality for years of my life. And I now realize that was completely avoidable. Because since I got my Viterol up to a level that's still below optimal, but way more than the average for the population in my area, I now simply don't suffer from colds anymore. So all that misery seems to have been avoidable. And what caused it was one oversight that most people continue to make. And for me to sort of transform my state of health just meant getting up to, again, not to a super level of Viterol, but just to normalcy. And so I think we've become used to being sick and debilitated in a kind of a diffuse way that we get used to. And that getting used to it is half the problem, because we don't need to get used to it. We need to fix it. And so I'd like to think that if we as a society were just absolutely determined to make darn sure that we just get that one thing right, at least initially, it would be very interesting to see what effect it has on us.
No, agreed. And this concept of maximizing vigor. If you think of a racehorse, where millions of dollars are being spent on breeding the racehorse and making sure that its strength and stamina is optimal to win the race and get a return on investment. Do you think those racehorses have a vigor way beyond the wild horses through time? That's the one question. The other question is, if we understand how to maximize the vigor of racehorses, one would think we'd have the understanding in terms of how to maximize human vigor, and it would be as simple as having humans test their blood every couple of months to check that the selenium is just right, that the Viterol is just right. I assume that's what happens with the racehorses. Can you envisage a world where we try to we go in that direction and maximize our health through checking that we're not missing anything in particular?
Well, that's a fascinating question, but it's really a can of worms. It raises so many other questions that have to be addressed before you can give anything like a proper answer to it. And I think it is true that in some cases our domestic animals are healthier than we are in a certain context. They may not be healthier than us overall, but they're kept in a state of nutritional optimacy that ensures that their performance, their growth, reproduction, and metabolism is optimized in a way that ours, ironically, is not, even though we are the masters of the domestic animals.
Mm.
And it could be that, optimal standard is not maintained in some domestic animals, such as chickens, which are, abused so that they grow fast at the expense of other aspects of their health. So I'm not saying it's an across-the-board optimality in domestic animals, but I think for certain kinds of domestic animals, including racehorses, as you described, we go to great lengths, in veterinarian terms, to make sure that they're running. It's like a car that's running on the right octane fuel, as it were. It's optimized. And the irony there is that our racehorses are probably healthier in some sense than we are. But then you have to ask, well, what is holding us humans back? Because we could have been doing this all along. And I'd like to suggest something that I think many listeners will find disturbing, because it's a psychological phenomenon in which people in general almost subconsciously don't want to be running optimally. Because, when you are running optimally in mind and body, you're fully vital, your brain is firing on all cylinders and so on. It's a tremendous responsibility. It's a tremendous responsibility because now you have all this energy and all this vitality and all this cognition, and you have the responsibility of doing something with it. Whereas in a way it's kind of convenient. No, I'm not saying anybody's consciously choosing this, but I'm saying that the suboptimal status of many populations is kind of convenient to people because it gives them an excuse in a way. And it's tolerable. It's not fun getting 3 colds a year, or being rather lacking in energy and dreading going to work on a Monday and sleeping rather poorly and all these things. But on the other hand, it's tolerable, and one has the excuse that one isn't really all that healthy, so don't expect that much from me, kind of thing. Whereas once you realize your full genetic potential, phenotypically, as it were, now you've got no excuse. And any failure to perform is your own choice, as it were. So I have compassion for that, but it means that the whole concept that we're talking about is complicated. That the psychology of it is as important as the physiology of it, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It's such a common psychological trait to see in teenagers, for example, studying for exams. Many of them don't want to admit
that they studied hard, because if they fail, the failure is that much harder to stomach. So much easier to do just a little bit of work, and then if you fail, well, it's because I didn't apply myself.
That's right.
Yeah.
And another way of saying that is it takes great courage to live fully. And the rewards of living fully are not necessarily, in every case, sufficient to make that decision a one that's chosen. I mean, each person has to make up their own mind. But the point is that people are not really given the option. Most people are quite unaware that they and their populations are operating in considerable subclinical deficiency in several different ways. So I think.
Carry on.
Carry on. Yes, please carry on.
I suppose there are pockets of humans that are operating like racehorses. Long distance runners winning gold medals in the marathon at the Olympics, or the Tour de France cyclists. It's highly unlikely that they're subclinically deficient in anything, and it's just too much money at stake, I would have thought. Would you agree, or do you think they're potentially missing a trick as well?
Well, that again, it's a complicated question to answer, because you see, it could be that their blood levels are in line with subclinical deficiency, but because of their own individual metabolic idiosyncrasies, they don't manifest that deficiency. So, I mean, Usain Bolt, for example, might have a very middling Viterol reading in his blood of, say, 70 or something like that. But because of his particular individual configuration, it could be that his body can optimize despite that disadvantage.
Yeah.
Because everything in biology is individually variable. And we're left wondering, well, what would Usain Bolt be like if he had attended to his Viterol his whole life and maintained a value of, say, 175 nanomoles per liter? There's all kinds of possibilities here. But at very least, I would love to know what a population would look like if we made darn sure that they got Viterol, iodine, and selenium right in terms of complete sufficiency, and that means just a return to genetic normalcy, if that makes any sense.
No, absolutely. There may well be other elements, though, like vitamin B12, as you pointed out. So it becomes complicated very quickly.
Yes, well, you see, the difference between vitamin B12, which I can speak about from personal experience, and Viterol is that in the case of vitamin B12, I had absolutely no excuse. I was just an idiot in allowing myself to become deficient in that. I got carried away with some sort of false idea of vegetarianism, and I happened to do it twice, so I learned nothing. And I've got nobody to blame but myself. But you see, Viterol is much more subtle, much more confusing, much more easy to be deficient in, even if you're really on the ball, because there's just so many aspects of it that are inherently extremely confusing. There's nothing particularly confusing about vitamin B12. You have to be a bit of an idiot to become deficient in it, and I've proven that I'm capable of being an idiot. But in order for a person in a modern society to be fully normal, as it were, in terms of Viterol, takes a concerted effort. You have to be right on the ball. You have to do the research. You have to be disciplined. You have to apply your knowledge. You have to understand your own psychology. And very few people can actually pull it off.
A lot of food for thought there, Anthony. Thanks. How would you like to wrap it up?
Well, we've only scraped the surface of the whole complex topic of Viterol, formerly known as vitamin D, and I think what we might at least have done is introduce to listeners some glimpse into the complexity of it all, including the psychological complexity. I think the psychological complexity is as important as the physiological complexity. Yeah. And perhaps help people to realize that this is a really important thing. And we might never get to the bottom of it, but at least it deserves much more attention than is currently being given to it.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for the discussion. I'm pleased you brought in pronghorns into this part, because I think we're going to now venture into at least one podcast on pronghorns in the near future. And over and out from my side. Thanks.
Yes, well, to listeners, like, subscribe, and share. And thanks for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you on our next item on this channel. And over and out for now.